In this edition of Global Print, I'm going to talk to you about the India-Sri Lanka relationship. Now, all of you know that Sri Lanka is a tiny teardrop-shaped island nation to the south of India, a tiny country, very close relations with India always. But for the last few years, Sri Lanka and China have had a very close tie. But before I explain to you why this relationship or this triangle between India, Sri Lanka, and China is becoming even more interesting, dear viewer, I'd like to make an appeal to you. Please do subscribe and pay just a little bit for the Print's free, fair, objective, and unhyphenated journalism. It's very little money, only rupees 159, but as a subscriber, you get a variety of benefits that other non-subscribers don't have. So please do subscribe, click on the join button, and become a subscriber. Now, back to my column Global Print, which you can also read on the Print's website, in which I talk about the India-Sri Lanka relationship. And just to put this into perspective, last Saturday, which is less than a week ago, India's Foreign Minister, External Affairs Minister, Mr. Jaishankar, spoke to Sri Lanka's Finance Minister, Basil Rajapaksa, and promised to alleviate Sri Lanka's dire economic situation. You all know that Sri Lanka, which is very heavily tourist dependent, has been going through a really bad time over the last couple of years because of COVID. It's an absolutely beautiful country, but unfortunately, because of the COVID situation, it has not been able to attract the kind of tourists that it had been earlier, pre-COVID. So a huge default. It's been staring at a default for some time now. So Mr. Jaishankar promised to help Sri Lanka out of its economic mess and promised it a $912 million loan, as well as a potential $1.5 billion line of credit, or two lines of credit actually, to buy fuel and food supplies from India. So that was quite a remarkable gesture, not only on the part of India, and here I'm not trumpeting what India is doing, but what is remarkable is that this has come hot on the heels of Wang Yi, that's the Chinese foreign minister's visit to Sri Lanka over a week or so ago. Mr. Wang Yi was, before Sri Lanka, he was in a couple of countries in Africa. Then he went to the Maldives, and he ended his 5-nation visit in Sri Lanka before he went back home. Now, just to give you some context of the Sri Lanka-China relationship very quickly. So some years ago, China offered to build a port in a town called Hambantota, which is in the south of Sri Lanka, as well as an airport in a place called Matala. Now, both Hambantota and Matala are in Prime Minister Mahinda Rajapaksa's constituency. So that port was built, but when Sri Lanka could not pay the EMI on that loan, it had to hand over control of the port to a Chinese company called China Merchants Agency for a 99-year lease. And that has resulted in people all over the world asking, is Sri Lanka, like several other countries around the world, like Laos, Djibouti, Zambia, is Sri Lanka falling into a debt trap? And that became even more interesting because Sri Lanka, being very much part of an Indian Ocean nation, also very much part of SAARC, which is the South Asian Association for Regional Cooperation, the South Asian regional grouping that both India and Sri Lanka are part of. And most importantly, the fact that India and Sri Lanka have had a very, very ancient historical and cultural link. You know that. You know that for a fact. But also in post-independent India and Sri Lanka, India becomes independent in 1947, Sri Lanka follows 1 year later, a very, very close tie between the political elite in both countries, the Bandaranaikes, the Gandhis, and most recently Prime Minister Narendra Modi and the Rajapaksas, who share a very warm and friendly relationship. But despite that, so what was interesting was that despite that, the Rajapaksa brothers were inclined to forge a much firmer relationship with China. So let me just tell you, there are 4 Rajapaksa brothers who are in power in Sri Lanka, who run Sri Lanka. The Prime Minister, like I said earlier, Mahinda Rajapaksa, the President, Gotabaya Rajapaksa, the Water and Irrigation Resources Minister, Chamal Rajapaksa, and the Finance Minister, Basil Rajapaksa. So talk about there being dynasty politics in a country. So anyway, Mr. Jaishankar spoke to Basil Rajapaksa and promised that India would help alleviate Sri Lanka's economic situation. But that came in the wake of a very interesting event. In early January, on the 3rd of January, the Sri Lanka cabinet cleared a proposal that had been hanging fire for 34 long years, since actually the India-Sri Lanka Accord was signed between Rajiv Gandhi and then Sri Lankan President Julius Jayawardene. And as part of that Indo-Sri Lanka Accord, Sri Lanka had conceded that India would develop in Trincomalee, which is a tiny, very, very beautiful little town on the eastern coast of Sri Lanka, that India would develop these oil tanks. Now, there are about 99 oil tanks in total. So India and Sri Lanka would jointly develop this. So this has been hanging fire for the last 34 years. And for one reason or another, as the relationship between the two countries dipped and rose, the oil tank project got caught up in those political winds. But on the 3rd of January, the Rajapaksas, so Prime Minister Mahinda Rajapaksa, leading from the front, got the cabinet to finally clear the project. And let me give you a little bit of detail about this and what this signifies. So Indian Oil Company's subsidiary Lanka IOC will run 14 of the 99 oil tanks. The Ceylon Petroleum Corporation will run 24, and a joint venture between these two companies called the Trinco Petroleum Terminal Private Limited will run the remaining 61 oil tanks. CPC, which is Ceylon Petroleum Corporation, will own 51% of the joint venture, while Lanka IOC, which is the Indian company, will own the remaining 49%. And this joint venture is scheduled to last for the next 50 years. Now, this is a really, really big deal. First of all, it's been hanging fire, like I said, for 34 long years. And second of all, what it does is that it establishes an Indian toehold, a foothold on Sri Lanka's eastern coast. And if you look at the map, that's very significant. So not only is Trinco very close to Chennai, both countries, geographically very close to each other, but also Trinco is very much on the sea voyage route across the world. So tankers from the west that come, through the Mediterranean and come all the way down across the Cape of Good Hope, so some through the Red Sea, and come around Sri Lanka. This is Trincomalee is a key stop on that voyage or potential voyage. And again, on the east, on Sri Lanka's east, you have the Southeast Asian nations of Indonesia, and further east, you have China. So for 34 long years, a lot of other countries, both the US and the Chinese, have not been happy about the fact that Sri Lanka had once promised to India that these oil tanks would be developed, understanding that this gives India a geostrategic advantage in the Indian Ocean. But finally, the Rajapaksas, the four Rajapaksa brothers, very close relationship, very warm friendship with Prime Minister Modi, despite the close tie between Sri Lanka and China, cleared this project. And that is very, very significant. Of course, just a little bit more of this context. In November, Basil Rajapaksa came to India. He flew into Delhi, and there their External Affairs Minister, Mr. Jaishankar, promised him that India would help out Sri Lanka's dire economic situation. And of course, the oil tank project was part of the conversation, and Mr. Rajapaksa, Basil Rajapaksa, promised that Indian investment in Sri Lanka would also be welcome. So look at what's going on. On the one hand, the Sri Lanka-China relationship is moving from strength to strength. I told you about Hambantota and the Matala airport. And now for the last few years, a brand new city called the Colombo port city has been coming up on reclaimed land just around the Colombo port. So some of you who have been to Sri Lanka, if you've stayed at the Taj Hotel, it's shouting distance from the Taj. It's very much part of the Golf Face walkway. So you see, definitely in pictures you can see, but even physically in front of your eyes, if you're standing on the Golf Face, you can see this port city coming up. Now, another Chinese company called the China Harbour Engineering Company has invested $1.4 billion to reclaim 660 acres, which is about 2.4 square kilometers of land. It's spending this money just to reclaim the land. In exchange, it's got 43% of the project it owns. And again, this lease that the Chinese company has got on the port city is for 99 long years. Now, the Chinese argue, and a lot of Sri Lankan scholars also argue, that this kind of development, this kind of sort of 22nd century development is going to catapult Sri Lanka heads and shoulders above any other South Asian country, definitely, and definitely even many in Africa or in the ASEAN, and that is perhaps true. But that is tomorrow's story, because this Colombo port city is going to take another few decades to be properly built, some say even 30 or 40 years. But what is going to happen today? When this kind of money is being invested by the Chinese, that naturally means that Sri Lanka is paying for that project. Now, alongside the Hambantota port, which has already been given to the Chinese company for a 99-year-long lease, again, Colombo City, the Colombo port project has also been given to this Chinese company. Remember that some months ago, India and Japan also wanted control of the East Container Terminal, which is a container of the Colombo port. But coming under pressure of the Chinese, the Rajapaksas brothers handed it again to another Chinese company. And in exchange, when things got a bit rough between Sri Lanka and India, because India was promised that it would be able to develop this East Container Terminal, and the Sri Lankans did not live up to that promise. In exchange, the Sri Lankans have said, okay, we give you the West Container Terminal, and the Gautam Adani companies has won that contract. Now, perhaps the Sri Lankans or the Rajapaksa brothers, both Mahinda and Gotabaya, were trying to mollify the Indians by giving them the West Container Port terminal instead of the East Container Port. And, while again, that's going to take a couple of decades at least to be built and for it to become active. But be that as it may, the point of my column is that the fight against China in South Asia has begun, and that India is helping this South Asian nation called Sri Lanka, which has been in bed with the Chinese for some years, to potentially avert a debt trap. So the question, has Sri Lanka fallen into a debt trap, and is this trap a Chinese debt trap, and how deeply is Sri Lanka embedded in it, and how deeply is it beholden to the Chinese? So if you look at what's going on, Mr. Jaishankar speaking to Basil Rajapaksa, offering this loan, is a sure sign that for the first time in years, India is back in the game, at least in the Indian Ocean. So let's just place all this in context. So you have Chinese troops, PLA troops, on the line of actual control in the Himalayas. This is the second winter. They're not going back. They're not returning to status quo ante. But in the Indian Ocean, India has been clawing back influence, successfully so. First in the Maldives, when a few years ago, the MDP, that's the Maldivian Democratic Party, led by Ibu Soli and Mohammad Nasheed, came back to power. And now in Sri Lanka, the same Rajapaksas, once so beholden to the Chinese, returning home, as it were, returning to this close-knit, very tight bond between India and Sri Lanka. So there you have it, dear viewer. I hope you will read my column in the Global Print Thank you so much for watching this video, and I look forward to your comments on this one.